This guy asked the girl out, tried to charm her and got rejected, but he wasn't the kind of man who could take no for an answer, so he decided to take what wasn't his by force. She fought back, but he was simply too strong. This isn't for you. Get out. This was about to become the worst day of her life. That bastard was about to steal her innocence. But then our protagonist just happened to be flying overhead on his dragon. He landed, took one look at the situation and asked, "Isn't this illegal?" Well, if that's the case, then he's about to do something illegal too. He's going to teach this coward a lesson he'll never forget. And trust me, he's not about to show him any mercy. But before we get to that, we need to go back just a little. About 200 years, a guy had slept for 200 years. When he awoke, he found a hot woman had been waiting for him all along. The demon woman claimed she wished to repay a debt of gratitude. He was utterly bewildered, for in his memory, he had clearly slain the demon king. 200 years ago, Abel stood before everyone and with every last ounce of his strength brought the demon king's reign to an end. The world was bathed in light, yet his eyes held not a single trace of warmth. Afterward, Roy, the hero who had led their party, came to find him. Roy told him that the world was now at peace and therefore there was no longer any need for his amber eyes. In this world, the color of one's eyes revealed their magical affinity. Red eyes signified the fire attribute, blue eyes the water attribute, green eyes the wind attribute, and his, a golden amber capable of encompassing every attribute. Those eyes were a mark of supreme power, yet they also bore a striking resemblance to those of the demon race. Roy explained, once peace was established, humanity would inevitably turn on itself. When that time came, those eyes would only be seen as a bad omen. They had prepared a secluded island villa for him, hoping he would live out his days there in quiet, invisible obscurity. Abel's heart plummeted into an abyss, pierced by a bone-deep sense of betrayal. Years of fighting side by side, and all he had earned was betrayal and exile. In the end, he calmly agreed. He would disappear from their sight, but he would never set foot in that beautiful cage. He turned and walked away, and yet, he bore no hatred toward those he had once called comrades. His hatred was reserved for the world, a world that had no place for a pair of amber eyes. In time, he withdrew deep into the mountains, dedicating his entire existence to, for the first time in the history of civilization, he made reincarnation magic a reality. A single drop of potion fell upon the coffin, opening a passage toward the future. He longed to travel 200 years ahead. He believed it would be a new world, one that could accept the amber eye. He lay down calmly within the coffin, and let his consciousness sink into the long darkness. Some unknown time later, a surge of power burst the lid open from within. He struggled upright, and immediately sensed something strange about his body. His limbs were small and slight, clearly the body of a child. Having gone so long without use, his power was momentarily difficult to control. It seemed the reincarnation had succeeded. This was the world 200 years in the future. His soul had taken up residence in the vessel of a young child's form. After 200 years, no one would remember what he looked like anyway. Just then, a faint but unmistakable presence put him on immediate alert. It was the aura of the demon race, slowly drawing closer to the cave. Light footsteps. A woman, perhaps? How had she managed to slip past the barrier? Had the barrier truly deteriorated so much over 200 years? With this body, he wasn't sure how much power he could actually wield. The door was pushed open just a crack. This fleeting moment was his only chance. He gathered his magic, resolving to strike first with everything he had. Light coalesced in his palm, but froze at the very instant he was about to release it. He forcibly reined in the spell that had nearly slipped free. Standing in the doorway was a slender young woman. Her face was written all over with astonishment, not amber. Her eyes were a clear, water-like blue. A human. How could she have possibly broken through the barrier to get here? The basket in the woman's hands fell to the ground with a thud. She collapsed to her knees. Tears welled up without warning, streaming down her beautiful cheeks. She said she had been waiting for this day all along. The devil was completely stunned. He had no memory of the woman standing before him. But then he watched her wipe her tears, and a sudden realization struck him. 200 years ago, he had taken pity on a young demon girl. He could still hear his teammates' furious protests ringing in his ears, yet he had protected her anyway. Back then, she had wiped her tears in exactly the same way. He couldn't help but note that her tearful nature hadn't changed a bit, so that little demon child had grown up after all. He spoke the name he had nearly forgotten, Lilith. Fresh tears rolled down her face, yet she smiled, confirming that she was indeed Lilith. She said she had spent over 100 years searching for him, to repay the kindness he had shown her. Only after finally learning the location of his reincarnation resting place had she come here at last. When she stood, Abel realized he only came up to her chest. He smiled ruefully, realizing just how badly his barrier had weakened. But what concerned him more was this. Her eyes were no longer the amber he remembered, that had once been the color of her soul. Had she truly managed to abandon it? Lilith offered no explanation. Instead, she reached up and removed the disguise from her eyes. 2 thin blue discs, and they had completely changed the color of her eyes. Her amber eyes were restored. She held up those 2 colored contact lenses. Abel stood speechless, a wave of complicated emotions surging within him. In the past, countless lives had been swallowed by war over the color of their eyes. So much blood had been shed, all over something that 2 thin discs could now resolve. Lilith wrapped a warm scarf around him, pulling him from his thoughts. She had prepared a home nearby, and intended to take him away from this frozen cavern. As they stepped out of the cave, a bitter wind swept across their faces. He gazed out at the distant village. He could only imagine how long she had been waiting for this day. The new home was filled with things he had never seen before. The glowing light bulb in particular filled him with curiosity, but the private study warmed his heart even more. Lilith knew that reading was his greatest love, and it was also the fastest way to understand this new age. He thanked her sincerely. After all, 200 years ago, books had been extraordinarily precious and rare. He immersed himself in the sea of books, trying to make sense of this unfamiliar new world. According to the texts, most energy in this era was derived from magic stones. The processing of magic stones had driven an explosive leap in civilization. Even light bulbs were powered by the energy within magic stones. He imagined that mags in this era must have things pretty easy. He read on, but his smile slowly faded. What the books revealed left him stunned. The overall standard of magic had deteriorated severely. What were now hailed as powerful spells were the kind every child knew in his time. Worse still, the books openly documented spell runes riddled with errors. Practicing with these methods would only ever lead to failure, or worse, an explosion. This future world had made technological leaps and bounds, yet magic had fallen into a sorry decline. Just then, a sound came from outside the door, not Lilith's. The presence was unfamiliar, and Lilith was nowhere nearby. The door was flung wide open. A runny-nosed little boy poked his head inside. With a grin, the boy asked if he was Lilith's little brother. Abel was baffled. What on earth was this child talking about? The boy, who called himself Ted, declared with great self-importance that he intended to take Abel as his underling. Abel felt a wave of helpless resignation. Judging by the fine clothing, the boy was clearly of noble birth. He calmly declined this so-called honor, but the boy began to pester and whine, insisting, loudly and persistently, that Abel had no choice but to agree. Pushed past his limit, Abel decided to drive the boy off in the most direct way possible. He warned the boy not to, and deliberately let him get a clear look at the color of his eyes. The boy was indeed taken aback. Abel thought his plan had worked, but Ted let out a thunderous burst of laughter. He shouted excitedly that this was the first time he'd ever seen the legendary amber eyes. Abel couldn't understand why the boy wasn't afraid. Just then, an older boy came rushing over to stop his younger brother. He was Ted's older brother, Boss, who scolded Ted for barging into someone else's home. But Ted couldn't wait to point to Abel, eager to share his discovery. Seeing Abel's amber eyes, Boss seemed to understand. He mentioned that Lilith had spoken highly of her brother's remarkable talent, but his words carried a barely concealed disappointment at seeing the reality for himself. Ted leaned in to explain that these chick-like amber eyes meant a complete inability to adapt to magic of any attribute whatsoever. Abel was inwardly stunned. This was the complete opposite of everything he knew. Amber eyes required grueling training to unlock their full potential, but once mastered, they could command powerful magic of every attribute. In the past, that power had drawn envy, yet it also commanded deep reverence. Boss scolded his brother for speaking so harshly, yet followed it with words of his own. He remarked that these days, one could live a perfectly happy life without any magic at all, and implied that Abel would be looked after in a manner befitting his station. Abel was inwardly appalled. He was being treated as someone utterly useless. Boss urged his brother to go home and practice his magic. Before leaving, Ted couldn't resist one last look back to mock Abel's chick eyes. Abel stared at the door as it slammed shut and felt a wave of absurd helplessness wash over him. In that moment, he suddenly understood the history he had just been reading. The world had been at peace for a century. The demon race had faded into distant legend. The amber eyes that had once mirrored those of demons naturally no longer inspired fear. In a peaceful era where the general standard of magic had fallen into decline, eyes whose worth only revealed itself through years of hard training had become a laughingstock. From being persecuted in the past to being ridiculed in the present, The simple, ordinary life he longed for seemed forever out of reach. Just then, Lilith returned, pulling him from his thoughts. Seeing what she was wearing, Abel understood her occupation at a glance. Lilith gave a light twirl and asked if it suited her. Abel felt a slight warmth rise to his and honestly replied that it did. Now his confusion was resolved as well. He understood why she had to conceal those amber eyes. Over 200 years, the status of amber eyes had been turned completely on its head. Lilith's expression grew sorrowful. She spoke of how the demon race had declined over those 200 years. Ever since the Demon King was defeated by the heroes, the remnants of the demon race had been hunted down and wiped out by humans, and the standard of mags had visibly plummeted as well. He took up her words, lamenting that even the truth of the power hidden within amber eyes had been forgotten. Then he asked her something sudden, whether as a member of the demon race, she harbored hatred toward humans and toward him. Lilith only gave a gentle smile and softly shook her head. She recalled how he had thrown himself into protecting her when she was little, wandering everywhere with her in tow. He had not only taught her magic, but also how to survive among humans. She rose to her feet, and with quiet but unwavering resolve, voiced the feeling she had long kept hidden. She confessed that for a very long time now, she had been deeply, deeply in love with him. Then she made a request. In the steam-filled bathroom, she gently wiped his back. He pointed out, slightly flustered, what a scene like this might imply. She only laughed softly, saying that with his child's appearance, he wasn't exactly making a compelling case. Still, just being seen as a woman in his eyes was more than enough to make her happy. That night, they shared the same bed. It was the first time in 200 years, the first time he had fallen into a deep, dreamless sleep. In the mornings that followed, he and she shared breakfast together. During the days he would immerse himself in books, soaking up the knowledge of this era. But every afternoon, the peace was rudely shattered by an uninvited guest. Ted, the noble son, would come barging in, demanding a playmate. He had no time for children, and found himself constantly scheming ways to escape. One day, he walked straight to the window and cast a simple spell. Under Ted's wide-eyed, open-mouthed stare, he leapt lightly onto the neighbor's rooftop. It wasn't even a fraction of his former ability, but it was more than enough to impress. Ted's competitive spirit was instantly ignited. He actually tried to muster his own magic and leap out the window. His body wobbled unsteadily, barely leaving the ground. His magic leaked out wildly and unchecked. Abel could see the problem immediately. That kind of control could never be sustained. Sure enough, Ted's magic gave out. He shrieked and tumbled down into the bushes below. Abel jumped down to check on him, but the embarrassed and furious Ted suddenly launched himself at him. Abel lightly stepped on his back and used it as a springboard to leap aside. Ted crashed straight into the wall. Looking at the boy clutching his nose in pain, Abel found himself thinking the kid could take a hit. With 20 years of training, he might actually become a decent mage. Ted was furious at this, accusing his underling of having some nerve to talk to him that way. Abel calmly denied being anyone's underling, but then a thought suddenly struck him. He immediately reversed course, saying he would be willing to be Ted's underling after all. Ted lit up with delight, but Abel said there was one condition. He thought of the warm scarf Lilith had given him. He told Ted that if he could snatch the scarf from him before sunset, he would gladly acknowledge Ted as his older brother. Ted thought it sounded easy and immediately agreed. Abel, however, had his own plans in mind. Since this noble young master was going to interrupt his reading every day regardless, he might as well use him as an excellent physical training partner. Ted came charging after him with burning determination. Abel leaped up onto the rooftop. The move instantly fired up Ted's competitive drive even further. He threw himself into a leap as well, and clumsily crashed right into the wall. Abel smirked inwardly. The gap between the two of them was astronomical. Yet Ted tried again, and this time actually made it up. He began giving chase in earnest. This actually surprised Abel a little. This time, Ted wasn't using enhancement magic. He was relying purely on his own physical ability. As Abel evaded him, he calmly sized up his pursuer. Average looks, and he didn't seem particularly sharp. Not a trace of intellectual presence about him. Only his stamina and sheer persistence were worth noting. Ted lost his balance on the rooftop again and went down hard. He demanded to know why Abel wasn't even the slightest bit tired. Abel deliberately asked if he was looking for an excuse to give up. As expected, those words sent Ted scrambling back into the chase. But to Abel's eyes, his movements were painfully slow. In the end, Ted was completely spent, collapsing in a heap. Still, the fact that he had lasted 20 minutes was more than Abel had expected. He turned to head back to his study, ready to put an end to this farce. But as he passed the window, he caught an unexpected glimpse of Lilith. She was inside, speaking with young Master Boss. Abel discreetly cast a spell to sharpen his hearing. He heard Lilith politely, but firmly declining whatever Boss had proposed. Boss instantly flew into a rage, roaring at her about what she could possibly find lacking. It seemed that a noble young master with a pride this fragile was, predictably, the type who found rejection from a woman the hardest to stomach. But Lilith quietly explained that her refusal had nothing to do with dissatisfaction. It was simply because her heart already belonged to someone else. Those words made even Abel, eavesdropping outside, freeze for a moment. Boss clenched his teeth. He asked if that person was her brother, Abel. Lilith was silent for a moment. Then, with a smile, she admitted that it was. Abel was completely stunned, a storm of emotion rising within him. Boss trembled with rage, hurling insults at her, calling her shameless to think she had fallen for her own brother. At the word shameless, Abel's gaze turned ice cold. After all, he was not Lilith's brother in the slightest, but the sibling cover was the most convenient disguise available to them for now. Boss's ugly words were certainly unpleasant to hear, but he had just been flatly rejected. That pitiful state of his made Abel decide to look the other way. From that day on, Ted became a constant little shadow trailing behind Abel. Playing with the young noble had somehow become a fixed part of his daily routine. After a few days of observation, Abel noticed something. Although Ted had blazing eyes suited to fire attribute magic, he lacked the complex reasoning needed to support high-level elemental spells. That instinctive talent for reading and constructing runes in an instant, he clearly didn't have it. Yet Abel also discovered a different kind of talent in him. When it came to physical enhancement magic, Ted had a remarkable natural intuition and aptitude. This kind of magic, one that required no reliance on logic, might be exactly right for him. Ted came charging at him again, brimming with excitement. Abel noticed that in just a few days, the kid had made tangible progress. At that moment, Boss spotted them through the window, his gaze fixed rigidly on two figures on the rooftop. Abel effortlessly deflected Ted's reaching hand, casually remarking that his movements were too slow. Ted tumbled on the rooftop, skidding across the snow for quite a distance. He scrambled back to his feet, frustration all over his face, but his foot slipped and he lost his balance completely. He screamed as he plunged off the edge and hit the ground hard. Tears sprang from Ted's eyes in an instant. Abel leaped down at once, assessed the situation, and suspected a fracture. He began to cast healing magic, but at that moment, Boss came charging over, roaring. He shoved Abel away with full force. He knelt beside his brother, declaring that he would perform the recovery magic himself. Abel was a little surprised. Could someone without grey eyes perform healing magic? But the green magical light rising in Boss's hands made Abel's eyes sharpen. It looked convincing enough on the surface, yet Ted's cries of pain grew louder and louder. Abel immediately sensed something was deeply wrong. Proper bone healing was like building with blocks. You always start with the large foundational pieces, but Base was doing the opposite, forcing large pieces onto small ones. It was nothing more than a surface-level illusion of repair. The internal structure was a complete mess. Such a joining would lead to catastrophic consequences. Abel urgently called out that a doctor needed to treat him immediately, but Boss roared back in fury. It was not a commoner's place to give him orders. He accused Abel of being the one responsible for Ted's fall, and pointed out that Ted was a noble, the honored second son of the Langbert family. He repeatedly hurled insults at Abel, calling him a backwater trash with inferior eyes. He declared he would never let off anyone who damaged the dignity of his noble name. His longsword was drawn, and Base issued a challenge to duel. Abel froze on the spot, overcome with weary resignation, because Ted was still lying on the ground, groaning in agony. A duel right now was hardly the wisest course of action, but the commotion had drawn onlookers, making the situation even harder to manage. He had no choice but to accept the challenge. Base announced the rules and magnanimously offered to give him a handicap. Abel declined his generosity. He just wanted this over with quickly. The dismissive indifference was the last straw for Base's composure. He let out a furious cry and unleashed his prized finishing technique. A spell called Wind Cleave tore through the air with tremendous force. Abel stepped aside without effort. The attack split the great tree behind him clean in two. He quietly assessed. The power was decent enough, but the casting speed was exceptionally fast. In the past, that kind of speed had been within reach of almost no one but him. Yet the opponent before him clearly didn't possess that level of ability. The answer had to lie in that peculiarly designed sword. Base sneered in triumph, asking if he had never seen a magic tool before. He boasted about the sword's power, claiming it could assist in constructing spells. Then he swung the sword again, launching another fierce assault. This time, Abel caught a glimpse of the runes on the blade. Everything clicked into place at once. Base leaped high into the air, intent on overpowering him with sheer force. Abel only felt an overwhelming sense of weariness. With a casual flick, he neutralized the fierce attack with his bare hand. Base was visibly stunned. Still understood now, magic tools were the very root cause of mage decline. An over-reliance on convenient external devices had stripped people of the ability to think for themselves. He decided to put an end to this farce and show this man what real power looked like. He gathered his focus and the same windcleave took shape in his hands, but its scale and force were worlds apart from what had come before. The devastating windstorm left Base nowhere to run. He was sent flying, crashing to the ground in a heap, and that was Abel already holding back. He refused to concede, spitting bitter insults. Just then, a flash of skirt appeared without warning before him. Lilith, without any warning, swung her foot and drove it straight into his face. Base went flying once more. Lilith's voice was as cold as ice. She said slowly that she could let insults toward herself go in one ear and out the other, but she would not stand for anyone continuing to insult Lord Abel. She looked down at him from above, her eyes full of cold warning. Base was scared out of his wits by the sudden viciousness. Abel had no choice but to call out and stop Lilith. The doctor declared that Ted would need to rest for half a year. Abel's heart sank to the floor. For a lively boy like Ted, that was nothing short of imprisonment. Standing outside the window, Abel listened to the diagnosis, his brow deeply furrowed. 6 months was far too long. After Ted fell asleep, a teleportation magic circle appeared without a sound. Abel emerged, resolved to intervene in a more direct manner. He had originally intended to test the medical standards of this era, but now he abandoned that idea. Magic gathered in his hands, enveloping Ted's injuries. First, he erased every trace of Base's magic. Then, using a far more refined technique, he knit the bones together and accelerated the healing. Throughout it all, Ted lay peacefully lost in sleep. Looking at his sleeping face, Abel felt a deep wave of guilt wash over him. Before he left, he whispered softly, "I'm sorry." The next morning, Abel opened the door and found Base standing there with a shaved head. He almost didn't recognize him, hesitantly calling out his name. Base immediately exploded like he had been stepped on, flying into a fury. At the next second, the back of his head received a solid punch. It was his father, Ivan. He knelt on one knee and apologized for his son's foolish behavior. Base couldn't understand why his father would bow to a mere commoner. He was nothing more than the younger brother of their maid. Those words earned him another punch from his father. Ivan finally revealed the truth. It wasn't that their family had hired Lilith. Quite the opposite. It was Lady Lilith who had been employing their entire family all along. Boss stood rooted to the spot, his entire worldview shattered, and Abel at last understood. The question that had long puzzled him was finally answered. He had long wondered why Lilith, a high-ranking demon, kept such a low profile. It turned out to be the survival wisdom of the demon race living within human society, outwardly playing the role of an obedient servant, while quietly and skillfully leveraging the power of the nobility behind the scenes. After that, Boss disappeared from town. Word had it he had gone to study at a top magic academy. Ivan gathered Ted close and told him of the past. When Ivan was young, he had been attacked by a monster in the forest. It was Lilith who had appeared like a divine being and saved his life. Afterward, she had supported him in many ways and taught him the knowledge of magic. Whatever their formal relationship, she was the benefactor and neighbor he deeply respected. He told Ted to get along well with that pair of siblings. Ted agreed with a grin. He had long since come to think of Abel as his closest friend. That afternoon, Ted slipped into Abel's study as usual, but this time, he called out Master with a beaming grin. Abel turned with a sigh, wondering what scheme the kid had cooked up this time. 2 years slipped by in a tumble of bickering and laughter. It was one of the rare stretches of leisure in his long life. Abel gradually grew familiar with this world 200 years in the future, and Ted too had shed his childishness. His magic had progressed with remarkable speed. He could now cast fire magic with real skill, and the power behind it was nothing to dismiss. Abel watched him with a smile of genuine approval. Ted then invited him to take entrance exam with him tomorrow. The invitation gave Abel pause. He went to ask Lilith, why should someone who had already stood at the pinnacle 200 years ago need to go to school now? But Lilith fired back. If he didn't attend the academy, how did he plan to make a living? He said he would become an adventurer, just as he had before. But Lilith informed him that the profession of adventurer had been abolished for 10 years now. In a time of peace, it was a profession without a purpose. She pointed out that if he wanted to work in any magic-related field, formal education was a must. Then she added with a teasing smile whether he really wanted to spend his days as her kept boy. Those words finally made him relent and agree to take the exam. The next day, Ted eagerly led him through the gates of the kingdom's foremost magic academy. Beyond the grand gates, Whispers and contemptuous glances followed them like shadows. The enrolled students behind them discussed his inferior eyes without even bothering to keep their voices down. They mock how far the academy had fallen to let someone like him sit the entrance exam. Abel thought the character of these noble children was remarkably poor, but Ted beside him was already hopping mad, furiously taking his side. Just then, a clear, sharp female voice rang out and silenced them. She accused them of ganging up to slander someone behind their back, behavior utterly unbecoming of nobles. Abel turned around and saw a familiar crest gleaming on the girl's chest. He had a sense that he had seen that emblem somewhere before. The instigators arrogantly demanded to know who she was, and the girl held her head high as she introduced herself. Her name was Alyssa, and her goal was to become a great mage whose name would echo through history. A clash seemed inevitable. The others wanted to teach this presumptuous exam candidate a lesson. Alyssa simply stepped back in silence, and then a blade flashed. The sharp tip of a sword was pointed straight at them, the motion clean and swift. Abel noted inwardly that her swordsmanship was quite impressive. Alyssa told them coldly to get out of her sight. The instigators retreated in embarrassment, tossing out a threat to save face as they went. Abel felt he ought to thank her, so he called out to stop her. Alyssa didn't stop, so he reached out to hold her back, but she slapped his hand away with sharp force. Alyssa snapped at Abel that he was a mere commoner and had no business touching her. She made it clear she simply despised people who talked behind others' backs. She wasn't there to help a commoner. She turned and walked away, stating that she was only interested in people of true strength. Ted was once again infuriated by her arrogance. He shouted that she had no idea what real strength looked like. Abel, however, watched her retreating figure, with a nagging feeling that he had seen that face somewhere before. Next came the written portion of the entrance exam. For Abel, the written exam was laughably easy, until the final subject, magical engineering, where the difficulty suddenly spiked. That last question was clearly designed to prevent anyone from scoring perfectly. He thought for a moment, and a smile crept to the corner of his lips. What a laughably fitting coincidence, because the person who had derived that theorem was none other than himself 200 years ago. When the written exam concluded, everyone was led out to an open field. What awaited them next was a practical skills test on the use of magic tools. The table was covered with magic tools of every kind. The examiner instructed the candidates to choose based on their eye color. Abel had no expectations. There was unlikely to be anything here prepared for amber eyes. He calmly picked up a red one-handed sword as a substitute. The examiner announced that the targets were made of magic-absorbing black matter. Candidates were free to unleash their magic to their heart's content. Ted was the first to raise his hand excitedly, asking to go ahead of everyone else. Abel couldn't help but feel a flicker of worry for him. Everyone gathered here was among the elite. He was afraid Ted's half-baked level would make him a laughingstock in front of the crowd. Ted wound up with everything he had, and shouted as he launched a fireball. But the magic that came out was barely a flicker. Abel felt a wave of disappointed frustration, just as clumsy as ever. The feeble burst of magic struck the center of the target and faded away without a trace. Yet the entire venue erupted in a wave of commotion. Abel assumed it was ridicule, but to his surprise, the examiner cried out in genuine admiration, declaring Ted to be exceptional talent. The other candidates looked deflated, complaining about the pressure of following someone so strong. Abel couldn't believe it. This level was actually considered impressive here. The candidates who followed confirmed his suspicion. Their magic was even weaker, like a clumsy talent show performance. The target sustained nothing more than a few scratches. When his turn came, the examiner's tone carried a note of hesitant concern. Abel felt a familiar wave of resignation. The examiner had clearly underestimated him because of his amber eyes, but Ted clapped him enthusiastically on the shoulder, urging him to everyone what he was made of. That wholehearted, unconditional trust sent a warmth blooming through Abel's chest. He picked up the magic tool and stepped up to the starting position. Countless spectating eyes bored into his back, laced with whispering. They mocked his slow spell construction, fitting for someone with inferior eyes. Abel tuned them out, absorbed in thinking through an elegant combination. Since the target was made of dark matter, he might as well go big. He activated his spell. Fireball, Type 2 split. A torrential surge of magic erupted, rocketing skyward. Everyone stood slack-jawed, stunned by the sheer scale of it. Abel thought to himself this was more than just big. The sphere of magic rose high into the air, then came crashing down like a firework. As the onlookers stared on in disbelief, the target was completely swallowed whole. When the smoke cleared, all that remained was a terrifying crater in the ground. The entire exam hall fell dead silent, then exploded into uproar far louder than before. Ted leaped into the air with excitement, cheering at the top of his lungs. Abel was certain he had just shaken loose some of those deeply entrenched prejudices. In another exam hall, Alyssa unleashed her with a thunderous strike. The blow carried considerable power, enough to crack the surface of the black target open. The examiner could barely hide their shock, and sharp intakes of breath rippled through the crowd. Yet Alyssa herself felt nothing but utter boredom for this so-called top academy to be rattled by something at this level. Just then, an examiner from the adjacent hall suddenly came rushing over. Alyssa quietly enhanced her hearing and caught fragments of the exchange. The keywords were Amberite Candidate, and the target was destroyed. Her heart gave a jolt. She immediately thought of the person she had encountered that morning. A smile of genuine excitement finally climbed to the corner of her lips. Things were finally getting interesting. After the exam, Abel was rated as Class A. Ted also received Class A and could barely contain his smugness. The two made their way to the waiting room reserved for Class A candidates. The room was sparsely populated, yet the moment they walked in, all eyes were on them. Every gaze locked onto the amber color of Abel's eyes. Whispered conversations swept through the room, all speculating about the rumor that he had destroyed the target. A familiar voice rose from nearby. Alyssa walked straight over. She asked directly whether the story about the target being destroyed was true. She pressed him on how the spell had been constructed, suspecting he had trained under a famous master. Seeing Abel remain silent, she declared she would find the answer for herself in the next test. Examiner Phidia appeared at just the right moment, announcing the rules for the final assessment. The format was a simulated duel, simple and straightforward. Two candidates would face off, and whoever had their defense broken first would be the loser. Opponents would be matched by performance in the earlier rounds. The outcome was no surprise. Abel's opponent was Alyssa. On the dueling stage, Alyssa drew her sword in one fluid motion, telling him to bring out his weapon. Abel replied that he wasn't in the habit of relying on magic tools in a fight. Alyssa laughed, calling him old-fashioned. Without hesitation, she charged, swinging her sword with lightning ferocity. Abel silently acknowledged that her skills were impressive by the standards of this era. He didn't move, yet the moment the blade was about to make contact, he vanished. In an instant, he had appeared behind Alyssa with effortless composure. Alyssa spun around in shock, but the fighting spirit in her eyes burned even fiercer than before. She gathered her magic again, and flames more intense than ever blazed along the length of her blade. A second flame cleave came roaring out with even greater force. This time, Abel had no intention of simply dodging. With the lift of his hand, he constructed the same fire element spell, but the magic behind it was far richer and more violent. Alyssa hadn't anticipated this at all. She found herself at a complete loss as to how to counter it, her mind going blank. The next second, the two forces of magic collided in mid-air with a thunderous crash. A blinding burst of light shattered outward, swallowing everything. When the roar faded, smoke billowed, and a terrifying crater had been carved into the ground. Abel reached out with his senses, but could detect no trace of his opponent. A flash of regret passed through him, worried he may have gone too far. Then a sharp rush of wind came screaming down from directly above. Alyssa plummeted from the sky like a meteor, launching a surprise attack. She had used a technique to conceal her presence. What a pity! Magic took shape in his hands in an instant. 12 blazing fireballs launched simultaneously, shrieking through the air. Alyssa's eyes went wide, her mind flooded with shock. That casting speed, and he could control 12 at once? She finally understood. This man was frighteningly strong. A chain of explosions sent a pillar of fire roaring into the sky, the force of it leaving the crowd breathless. The onlookers murmured among themselves that the gap between them was painfully obvious. When the smoke finally cleared, Alyssa was down on one knee, but the fighting spirit in her eyes hadn't been snuffed out. If anything, it burned even hotter. A faint trace of surprise flickered through Abel's mind as well. The examiner announced that her defensive spell had been broken, and the match was over. But Alyssa gritted her teeth and objected. She wasn't done yet. She demanded that the duel continue. Abel couldn't help but smile, genuinely admiring that stubborn refusal to give in. Alyssa pressed her sword into the ground and pushed herself upright, making a declaration to everyone watching. She was going to prove to every single person here that she was stronger than all of them. Abel let his smile fade and voiced the question in his mind. In a time of peace like this, why was she still so fixated on becoming stronger? This was nothing like the war-torn past. These days, even those without power ought to be able to find happiness. Alyssa fired back with conviction. Peace was nothing but an illusion. Even with a peace treaty in place, it was no of permanence. No one could promise that another Demon King wouldn't rise, and the neighboring nations had never stopped building up their armies. She refused to let herself sink into the comfortable delusion of a peace that could shatter at any moment. That was why she had to become strong enough to protect everything. And then, she was going to restore the family that had raised her. That line gave Abel a sense of something significant, but before he could dwell on it, Alyssa unleashed the last of her magic. Scorching flames enveloped her completely. Every person present was struck speechless. She called out the name of a forbidden spell. The flame surged upward and transformed into a massive pair of wings. With a sharp cry, she launched herself into the sky, carried aloft by the fire. The crowd cried out in disbelief at the breathtaking sight before them. Alyssa spread her wings high in the air, like a goddess of flame. From the stands came a stunned cry. Flight magic was actually real. Abel understood. This required precise, simultaneous control over multiple attributes. Even 200 years ago, only a rare few had been able to master this technique. This was not a skill that could be achieved in a short span of time. A familiar figure flashed through his memory. An old comrade from long ago. He hadn't expected an ancient magic to have been passed down so completely intact. What her family must have sacrificed and poured into this was beyond imagination. He announced that the display was over, and now it was his turn. A violet beam of light shot out with blinding speed, aimed directly at Alyssa in the sky. She braced herself and endured it, but felt the very foundations of a spell being rapidly torn apart. The next second, a searing burst of light erupted from directly behind her. Those magnificent wings of flame dissolved into scattered sparks in an instant. She cried out, and her body began to plunge. Abel leaped upward and caught her in midair. Holding her in his arms, he asked softly, the answer he already knew. Whether she was a descendant of Maria, the hero of flame, he brought her down to the ground safely, his tone carrying a hint of genuine appreciation. He told her she had real talent, and encouraged her to keep growing stronger. The examiner's voice rang out, declaring Abel the victor, and the whole arena erupted. The crowd surged toward him with cheers, treating him as a new hero. While Alyssa stood alone in the distance, watching the clamor from afar, a fierce mix of embarrassment and fury rushed through her at the same time. She raised a hand to cover her burning face, unable to understand how she had lost so completely. After the exam, the teachers were buzzing with excitement about this year's standout talents. They heaped praise on the three, Ted, Alyssa, and Abel. Only Emma Sen, the teacher grading the written papers, let out a scornful scoff. She stated plainly that there was only ever one true genius, Abel, and Abel alone. The other teachers were puzzled. After all, he was just an amber-eyed commoner. In terms of ability, Alyssa didn't appear to be any less impressive. Emma Sen shook her head with weary exasperation and held up the perfect score answer sheet. Abel had solved the ultimate theorem, a complex theory that even seasoned researchers had been unable to crack. Every teacher in the room went quiet. At that moment, the venerable headmaster walked through the door. He asked what had the teacher so animated. Emma Sen relayed the news with barely contained excitement. She had found an unparalleled genius, a student by the name of Abel. The instant that name reached the headmaster's ears, his eyes went wide. He was so overcome with shock that his dentures actually flew out of his mouth. He urgently demanded that Emma Sen repeat the name. When he heard Abel a second time, everything inside him fell into place. Deep into that night, the headmaster's office was filled with stunned, hushed whispers. The name Abel had made sleep impossible. He crossed to an ancient statue and gathered magic in his hands. Magic flowed into the sword the statue held, and the room began to tremble faintly. A hidden door to a secret chamber slowly revealed itself. He stepped inside, into a room packed with old texts. He went straight to a drawer and pulled it open. Inside lay a letter of considerable age resting in quiet stillness. Under the influence of magic, the paper unfolded. It was a final note from his grandfather, a truth written for the eyes of his descendants. The letter revealed a secret that had been completely erased from history. The tale the world celebrated, of the 4 sages who slew the Demon King, was a lie. With only the 4 of them, they couldn't have even touched a hair on the Demon King's head. The one who truly defeated the Demon King was a mage with eyes of amber. His name was Abel. The headmaster recalled his grandfather's repeated warnings. That 5th sage, simply for possessing amber eyes that resembled those of the demon race, he had been persecuted. Despite having power that could shake the heavens, his name had been struck from the history books. But how could a human being have survived 200 years? He resolved that he had to take a far closer look at this young man's true strength. In a capital city cafe after the entrance exams, Abel sat alone drinking coffee. Ted burst through the door in a flurry, excitement written all over his face. He waved his acceptance letter in the air, asking his master to guess the result. Abel barely glanced over, and immediately saw through the fact that he had already peaked. His little trick found out, Ted was deeply dissatisfied, but Abel suddenly shifted his gaze to a seat in the distance. He asked directly who was hiding over there. A red-haired figure hadn't done a very good job of staying concealed. Caught red-handed, she had no choice but to wave an awkward greeting. She claimed it was a coincidental encounter. This was simply her favorite place for cake. Naive Ted believed her without a second thought. Abel cut straight through the pleasantries and asked what she was actually there for. Alyssa immediately became flustered, her eyes darting around. She stumbled over her words and asked which class he had been placed in. She admitted that as much as she hated to admit it, there seemed to be a lot she could learn from him. Abel considered what she was after, but Ted couldn't hold it in, and blurted out the answer with great satisfaction. He happily announced that both he and his master had been placed in the top-tier Class A. Upon hearing it was Class A, Alyssa's eyes lit up. She immediately began humming a cheerful little tune and left in high spirits. Abel looked at Ted, genuinely puzzled about why she had come. Just then, the cafe door was gently pushed open again. The moment they saw who it was, both Ted and Abel froze. The one stepping through the door was Lilith, and she was wearing the uniform of an academy teacher. They asked her what she was doing in that outfit. Lilith announced with a smile that she had officially become a teacher at the academy, starting today. Ted was so stunned he could barely blink, unable to believe such a coincidence was possible. But Abel wasn't surprised in the slightest, knowing her abilities far surpassed the ordinary. Whatever Lilith set her mind to, she could accomplish without breaking a sweat. Lilith leaned close to his ear and promised to continue helping him in her new capacity. Before long, it was the day before the entrance ceremony. She personally walked the two of them to the student dormitories. For the next 5 years, everyone would be living together in these halls. Then she excused herself to take care of some business. After Abel thanked her, he and Ted, weighed down by an absurd amount of luggage, made their way inside. In the common hall, they met teacher Phidia, who served as the dormitory supervisor. Abel recognized her as one of the examiners from the entrance exam. Phidia recognized them as well, and handed over the official academy-issued uniforms. She reminded them that they were required to wear them whenever they left the grounds. Abel took the bag and immediately noticed something unusual about the uniform. He pointed out that a certain kind of magical inscription had been applied to it. Phidia explained they were inscriptions for anti-magic and stain resistance. Abel asked who had applied them, but the answer he received was vague and evasive. After collecting their keys, the two were assigned to adjacent rooms, but Abel couldn't stop thinking about that crude inscription on the uniform. Ted noticed something was off and asked what was wrong. Abel explained that the inscription work on the uniform was terribly done, a complete waste of good material. He decided on the spot to reapply the inscriptions himself and started by reworking Ted's uniform first. The moment Ted put it on, he felt light as a feather. Abel was satisfied with the result too. Just as he was about to work on his own uniform, Ted scooped up all his bags. Ted announced that he was going to conduct bun diplomacy in his new uniform. Ted pulled out a specialty from his hometown, snowball buns. He eagerly offered one to Abel to try. Abel found the taste fairly average and couldn't help but wonder if it was really a local specialty. But Ted paid that no mind and headed off with full ambition to share them with their neighbors. He had set himself a goal of making 100 friends at the academy, and with that he charged out the door. Abel figured that with Ted's personality, it just might actually happen. All he wanted for himself was to get through each day quietly and graduate without any trouble. After finishing the adjustments to his own uniform, a wave of tiredness came over him. He decided to take an afternoon nap, but just then, shouting erupted outside. He opened his door to find Ted surrounded by a group of students. Ted's face was a picture of confusion and innocence. Abel suspected the bun diplomacy had run into some kind of trouble. One of them was screaming at Ted, demanding to know if he was mocking them. Ted hastily explained he only wanted to make friends and meant nothing by it. But another one hurled a nastier insult, calling him an invasive species, and sneered that they wouldn't be friends with something that came out of a gutter. Abel had heard enough. He knew they were referring to a type of fish that destroys its ecosystem. Ted kept his smile and held out the bun that represented his hometown, but the other person simply smacked it aside. The bun hit the ground and rolled into the dirt. Ted's expression went dim in an instant. Anger rose inside Abel. These people had no right to trample someone's goodwill like this. He was about to step forward, but saw Ted quietly bend down to pick it up. Then another figure moved first. Alyssa stepped in and picked up the bun. Under the stunned gaze of everyone present, she calmly took a bite and gave it a score of 70. The group immediately laughed, mocking her for having no class, picking food up off the ground. Those words set Alyssa's fury completely ablaze. Abel thought, this isn't good. Ted might let it slide, but Alyssa absolutely wouldn't. He stepped forward decisively and told the whole sorry scene to stop right there. Ted called out to him in delighted surprise, adding that he didn't really mind. But Alyssa turned on Ted furiously, asking if he had any self-respect at all. Abel suddenly understood. Even among nobles, the discrimination ran this deep. When the group saw Abel stepping up, their mockery grew even more vicious. They sneered that someone with inferior eyes who couldn't use magic had no business calling himself anyone's master. Those words hit Ted's rawest nerve. He refused to let anyone speak ill of his master. He grabbed the person by the collar and demanded an immediate apology, but the other person shoved him away in disgust, telling him to let go. A memory suddenly flashed through Ted's mind. 2 years ago, he himself had mocked Abel's chick eyes in exactly the same way. He finally understood just how much pain he had caused the person he had hurt back then. Guilt and anger tangled together. He wanted to apologize, but this was not the time. The one he had grabbed began to struggle. Another person grabbed Ted by the shoulder. Then something unbelievable happened. Wherever they touched Ted, a sudden burst of light exploded. A powerful force detonated, sending both of them flying hard through the air. They crashed to the ground in a heap, utterly bewildered about what had just happened. Only Abel knew the truth. The inscription he had applied had activated. The reflective inscription would strike back against any act of violence. The timing was perfect. Abel exhaled quietly with relief. The group scrambled to their feet, threw out a parting threat, and fled the scene. Ted stood there, frozen. Then the next second, he came rushing over in excitement, convinced he must have some kind of hidden power. Abel was internally speechless. This kid's level of reasoning was genuinely concerning. But Alyssa grabbed Ted sharply by the arm and pulled him in to examine his uniform closely. She looked it over and exclaimed in amazement that it was the most perfect inscription she had ever seen. Ted said without hesitation that it was all his master's doing. Abel's heart lurched, and he rushed forward to clap a hand over Ted's mouth. But it was already too late. Alyssa had heard every word perfectly clearly. Abel grabbed Ted and hurried away. Alyssa stood there, still reeling. Abel was capable of magic at this level of difficulty. Just who exactly was he? The next day, the entrance ceremony was about to begin. The two of them sprinted down the corridor at full speed. Ted apologized for having said too much. By the time they reached the hall doors, Ted was already gasping for breath. But Abel noticed something unusual about the doors. He studied them carefully and realized it was not a trap. It was a welcome ceremony. To keep a low profile, he nudged Ted to go first. Ted was too afraid of some punishment waiting for latecomers and refused to budge. Abel simply gave him a firm shove through the doors. In an instant, the sound of mechanical gears and cheerful music filled the air together. Ted stood there with his jaw hanging open at the dazzling spectacle before him. Confetti rained down, and intricate little wooden puppets danced along with the music. Abel explained to him that it was all just magic, a mechanism designed to sense the magical energy of whoever opened the door and set itself in motion. They looked up to see wooden puppets several stories tall, all playing in welcome together. The other new students turned around, their eyes locking onto Ted. Everyone assumed he had been the one to trigger the grand ceremony. Even the rarely heard Knight's March had apparently been played in his honor. The group that had mocked them yesterday turned a shade of green with barely suppressed fury. Even the teachers became convinced Ted was the strongest new student of the year. Ted started grinning like an idiot all over again, completely forgetting his earlier fear and reluctance. Just then, the headmaster appeared calling the hall to order. He too was pleasantly surprised that the Knight's March had been heard this year. Abel stood quietly in the crowd, sizing up the new students around him. About 200 students per year, a larger scale than he had imagined. Ted leaned over, excitedly filling him in on the headmaster's background. That old man was the direct descendant of Roy, the hero of Wind. The name Roy sent 200 years of memory flooding back. They had fought side by side, close as brothers, and together they had brought down the Demon King. But what had come after was something Abel had no desire to revisit. The headmaster's speech dragged on and on. Ted was still flipping through the orientation booklet, trying to share more interesting tidbits. His mood had grown complicated, and he responded only with cold, short replies. The ceremony finally ended, and they followed the crowd in search of their classroom. Ted noticed he seemed low and asked with genuine concern. Abel shook his head, saying he was fine, but the words had barely left his mouth when his whole body tensed. Ted was even more confused, unsure what his master had sensed this time. Abel scanned the area warily, a deep unease rising within him. A strange gaze had settled on him. It wasn't the look of a living creature. It felt more like the prying eye of a magic tool. Had someone already caught wind of his hidden true identity? Who was investigating him? Back in the classroom, Everyone was already talking about him. A green-haired student was dismissing the previous day's humiliation, insisting that they had simply been knocked away by the defensive inscription on the uniform. Alyssa listened to all of this, her expression growing more and more irritated. The door opened, and Ted and Abel walked in together. Nearly every pair of eyes in the room snapped to them in an instant. Ted could feel the strange atmosphere and fidgeted with discomfort. Abel, however, had long since grown accustomed to this level of scrutiny and whispered commentary. A few familiar faces from the day before were already shooting hostile glances their way. Just then, a man in slippers walked in. He dropped his books carelessly onto the lectern and ran a hand through his messy hair, but that alone sent a ripple of barely contained excitement through the room. Ted was instantly lit up, recognizing who had just walked in. This was the most powerful mage of the current era. Abel recalled reading this man's papers. His abilities were genuinely worth acknowledging. Ted added that the difficult question on the written entrance exam had come from him. Abel understood now, but the man's unkempt appearance was somewhat unexpected. Teacher Emerson skipped roll call and launched straight into the lesson. A student boldly raised their hand, questioning whether he was too busy with research to bother teaching. Emerson didn't flinch, openly admitting it. He was only there to secure research funding. The student pressed further, asking why he had made an exception to take on this class as its homeroom teacher. Emerson's expression shifted, and he swept a serious gaze across the entire room. He said it was because there was something in this class he needed to verify for himself. The moment those words were out, his eyes landed directly and precisely on Abel. Abel's every alarm went off at once. There was no mistaking that look, the same gaze that had been watching him through a magic tool. It had come from this man. And so Abel's school life began, under the shadow of that uneasy feeling. His days settled into a rhythm. Classes, the library, back to the dormitory, the occasional quiet conversation with Lilith, routine to the point of monotony. The hardest thing to endure was the long, mind-numbing stretch of class time. Ted was always squirming in his seat, groaning about how difficult the lessons were. But for Abel, the material was so shallow it was almost physically painful to sit through. He had no choice but to use his own paper and pen in class to work on new magic of his own. One day, the teacher finally turned an impatient gaze in his direction. He called Abel up to the front to solve a problem. The intent couldn't have been more transparent, nothing more than an excuse to make an example of this inferior-eyed student and assert his authority. Abel stood calmly, holding just as little regard for this teacher. The man taught straight from the book, having students copy notes verbatim. Abel decided to show his own condensed approach instead. He stated up front that his answer might differ from what was in the textbook. Then he walked through his method, demonstrating how to cut the convoluted process down by 10 steps. The teacher on the stage was completely frozen. The students below erupted in stunned disbelief. The teacher, his dignity in tatters, swallowed his fury and told Abel to sit back down. As Abel turned to leave, a snide remark cut through the air. The same group from yesterday, every word dripping with contempt. Abel acted as if he hadn't heard a thing and walked straight back to his seat. He had no interest in spending any energy on this. Within the academy, there were 5 libraries in total, large and small. The large one had an enormous collection but far too many people. He usually borrowed books there, then went to read in one of the quieter, smaller ones. One day while he was absorbed in reading, a familiar voice broke the silence. It was Alyssa. He was mildly surprised he hadn't expected her to come to the library to study. She asked whether he had finished the day's coursework. He admitted honestly that he could finish those assignments before bed. After that, the two fell silent and each drifted back into their own books. Alyssa got stuck on a difficult problem and sat for a long time without writing a word. She was still debating whether to ask, when Abel's voice came first. Without looking up from his book, he pinpointed exactly where her thinking had gone astray. Alyssa blinked in surprise, startled that he had been paying attention while reading. She followed his suggestion and tried again, and soon had the answer. Abel quietly noted to himself that her ability to grasp things was miles ahead of most people. When they left late that night, Alyssa thanked him for his guidance. She asked curiously whether he spent every day like this in the library. When he confirmed that he did, she couldn't help but suggest he go out and see the world a little. City life was full of excitement and new experiences, like the restaurant everyone was raving about or the rare exotic fruit desserts. Abel immediately pointed out that every example she had given was food. She scrambled to add that there were also second-hand bookshops to browse. That caught Abel's interest at once. Alyssa seized the moment and cautiously extended an invitation, wanting to thank him for his help. Abel figured he had no particular reason to refuse and agreed. Just at that moment, a grating, sarcastic voice came from behind them. The same trio dripping with passive-aggressive mockery, taunting him for being popular with the ladies. Abel calmly asked what they wanted. The blue-haired one snapped back at him for being arrogant and told him to drop the act. The green-haired one went further and produced a magic tool, threatening to teach him a lesson, confident that without Ted around to protect him today, they could finally make him suffer. But Abel asked them a question first. He wanted to know why they despised outside students so much. The green-haired one's face twisted with instant rage, biting out the resentment he had bottled up. They'd spent years working and studying just to earn their place here, but outside students could walk in alongside them on the strength of a single exam. That infuriated him beyond reason. Abel laughed coldly and sighed, seeing no evidence of all that supposed hard work. He casually set down his bag. The next second, the magic tool was in his hand. They hadn't even seen him move. Even Alyssa's jaw dropped. Abel turned the weapon over in his hands with a slight frown. He pointed out that the magic tool was poorly maintained. The spell runes on it had degraded from neglect. Then he tossed it back carelessly, suggesting the owner take better care of his things. The green-haired student fumbled to catch it and went sprawling to the floor. Abel looked away from them and called to Alyssa that they were leaving. The green-haired student picked himself up, shaking with rage. He swore viciously that tomorrow he would make the two of them regret it. The next day's PE class had Ted buzzing with excitement. Abel and Alyssa watched him with a mix of resignation and understanding. After all, this was a class they only had once a week. The excitement was understandable. PE teacher Cantor announced that today's activity was magic ball combat. Everyone cheered. Ted asked curiously about the rules, and Alyssa didn't know them either. The teacher was about to explain when the green-haired student cut in smugly. He announced that they already knew all the rules by heart. Teacher Cantor smiled, his words carrying an unmistakable bias. He said that class always had to accommodate the ignorant students. The green-haired student shot a pointed look toward Abel's group. Alyssa was instantly furious, determined to teach them a lesson. But Ted cheerfully told her to relax. Having fun was what mattered most. Cantor began dividing them into teams. He called out names and had them gather accordingly. After the commotion died down, Abel's teammates assembled around him. Ted was still beaming about being on the same team as his master. Alyssa couldn't help but snap that he was as dense as a brick. Abel pointed out that every member of Team D was an outside student. The grouping was far too deliberate to be a coincidence. Ted finally caught on, realizing something was wrong. Two of their teammates admitted they had no athletic ability whatsoever. The other two said they were mediocre at best and had little confidence. Alyssa stepped up and promised she would carry the team. They decided they were going to win fair and square and shut the other side up for good. Those words reignited the fighting spirit in their teammates. Abel alone remained wary. The other side was not playing clean. Sure enough, the green-haired student threw out another taunt as he walked past, and Teacher Cantor's face wore a smirk that didn't belong on someone neutral. Abel understood immediately. Even the teacher was on their side. The match began quickly, with Team B on offense and Team D on defense. The rules were simple. The attacking side would fire 3 types of magic bullets using magic tools. The defending side had to dodge and survive, with the team keeping more members standing declared the winner. The battle started. Team DS members began moving and evading. Ted had a sudden realization. It was just like dodgeball. The words were barely out of his mouth before he pulled off a backflip to dodge an attack. He was instinctively sensing incoming attacks before they arrived. Abel thought his athletic reflexes were genuinely impressive, but the very next second, the bespectacled boy was hit and knocked out. The magic bullets had been weakened, but the impact still hurt. Ted barely managed to block one attack. Alyssa dodged another by a hair. Then 2 magic bullets came flying straight at Abel from front. Abel was just thinking it. Odd how direct and simple the attack seemed. When the bullets abruptly made a sharp right-angled turn at the last moment, he snapped his head around to see 2 more teammates already dropping to the ground. A single ambush had cost their team 2 members in an instant. Abel's heart sank completely, his alertness spiking to its peak. The attacking trio's faces broke into triumphant grins. Alyssa called out that the attack was an obvious violation of the rules. They had tampered with their no-attribute magic. The shooting gloves had been secretly fitted with runes designed to track targets. It was outright cheating, but the other side laughed it off, firing back that their opponents were just sore losers. One of them followed it up with a crude insult targeting Alyssa's body. That was enough to set Alyssa's fury completely ablaze. Abel immediately placed a hand on her shoulder and quietly told her to stay calm. He reminded her that verbal provocation was a standard tactic in a fight. Right now, they needed to stay focused and watch for attacks that could come from any direction. Alyssa's face flushed. Abel's closeness flustered her more than she expected. The match continued in chaos. Abel kept his head cool and observed everything around him. He noticed something different about the black-haired girl named Yukari. Her athletic ability was nothing special, but she kept warning her teammates of incoming danger. Broad field of vision calmed under pressure. A scout who was being grossly underestimated. Abel thought, if only her passive personality could be improved, she might become an extraordinarily capable mage. Just then, 3 magic bullets came screaming in from a sharp angle. They slammed squarely into her back. Yukari cried out in pain and pitched forward to the ground. The ferocity of the strike shocked everyone who saw it. Abel frowned. The other side knew to neutralize the scout first, but the green-haired student burst out laughing, sneering at her to get out of the way. He fired again, aiming straight at Yukari as she struggled to push herself up. Another direct hit to her back. Yukari curled up in pain. Alyssa whirled around in outrage, demanding to know what they thought they were doing. But the green-haired student just shrugged it off, shouting that he was simply driving out the invasive species. Before the words had even fully left his mouth, a denser barrage of bullets rained down on Yukari. Dozens of hits landed on her frail back. Tears and the sweat of pain slid down her face together. Ted rushed over to shield her, and Alyssa stepped in front to argue with them. But the green-haired student taunted Alyssa for getting too full of herself. The moment Alyssa was distracted by the argument, an attack came from behind her. Caught completely off guard, she was hit by a magic bullet and stumbled to the ground. Abel sighed inwardly. Alyssa let her emotions get the better of her far too easily. Ted couldn't take it anymore, and threw his hand up, protesting to the teacher on the sideline. He demanded the teacher rule on the unfair attack that had just happened. But before he could even finish, the same ambush found him too. Several magic bullets hit him in the back and put him flat on the ground. Abel rubbed his forehead helplessly. The one who had tried to help got taken out first. The green-haired student crowed with self-satisfaction, declaring that outside students were useless after all. Invasive species should crawl back to the gutter they came from. Alyssa and Ted lay there seething, no longer able to get back up and fight. Yukari was quietly sobbing, her body trembling from pain and fear. Abel looked around the field, his heart cold as ice. Less than 2 minutes into the match, the defending team had been nearly wiped out. The only one still standing on the field was him, alone. The 3 on the attacking side closed in, spoiling for the finish. The green-haired student took the lead, eyeing him the way a predator eyes its prey. He called to his teammates to concentrate their fire. 3 magic bullets launched at Abel simultaneously. The thought of giving up briefly crossed Abel's mind. It would certainly be easier, but the other side's viciousness stirred something in him, a cold, rising irritation. He made his choice and ducked down, slipping nimbly clear of the first volley. The attacks kept coming. The green-haired student looked like he had lost himself in it, but Abel moved through the dense barrage like smoke, light, and effortless. His teammates on the sideline cheered for him with frantic urgency. The green-haired student saw this and let out a scornful laugh. He asked Abel if he was already running out of breath. Abel felt not even a ripple inside. If anything, he thought the other side was the one getting tired. Just then, the teacher announced there was only 1 minute left in the round. The green-haired student's eyes went hard, and he began gathering a massive amount of magic. He decided to go all out. A colossal sphere of light suddenly materialized. Dozens of smaller magic bullets split off from it in every direction. Alyssa and Ted on the sideline watched with their hearts in their mouths. Abel spotted it immediately. The other side had illegally added a scatter rune. The green-haired student crowed triumphantly, daring him to dodge this one. Abel thought to himself, dodging it outright wouldn't be that hard, but he still preferred keeping a low profile. He quietly set his magic in motion beneath the surface, then crouched down and covered his head, playing at trying to shield himself. The magic bullets rained down, yet every single one slid away strangely before it could touch him. The entire crowd froze, unable to make sense of what they had just seen. The green-haired student's face went blank. He suspected his magic tool had malfunctioned. The final whistle sounded at that very moment, and Abel stood completely unharmed. Ted came charging over with excitement, declaring his master was incredible. Abel stopped him, reminding him it was too early to celebrate. In the next round, attack and defense would swap, and they had to knock out every single opponent. Now it was Abel, Ted, and Alyssa's turn to go on the attack. Ted was fired up, swearing they would take this round. Alyssa was eager to prove what they were truly capable of. Abel, meanwhile, was counting on his teammates to draw all the attention. The other side showed not a flicker of worry. They even threw out more taunts. Abel could tell that they had something up their sleeves. The signal to start the next round was given. The green-haired student ordered his team into a defensive formation. His teammates quickly went back to back, forming a tight defensive circle. Ted launched the first attack, magic bullet streaking forward. Alyssa followed right behind with her own offensive. Someone in the formation immediately called out, "Northwest, spear-type attack." Another followed up, "Southeast, disc-type magic bullet." Abel understood their strategy at once. They had split the coverage between them, sharing information to eliminate any blind spots. After a genuinely well-coordinated defensive formation, Ted looked flustered, turning to shout for help. Alyssa felt equally stuck, unsure how to break through. Abel had to acknowledge it. The other team's coordination was excellent, but they had still overlooked one thing. Abel called Ted over to his side. He told him that the finishing blow for this match was his to deliver. The two began talking in low voices, working out their final battle plan. A moment later, they looked up at the same time, eyes locked on their opponents. Ted, having heard the plan, raised his arm high above his head and began chanting an exaggerated, drawn-out incantation. The entire opposing team froze, baffled by whatever ritual he was performing. Even Abel found it a bit much. Then he quietly set his own magic in motion. Power flowed to Ted's fingertips, answering the rhythm of his chanting. Ted called out the final line to release the power, and Abel inwardly recited the true incantation for the storm magic. Yet nothing seemed to happen. Confusion began to ripple through the air until someone pointed at the sky in alarm and everyone looked up. A massive ring of magical energy had already taken shape overhead. Countless magic bullets poured down from within it like a rainstorm. The opposing team had no time to react. They were buried in the bombardment instantly. They fell one after another, the field left in ruin. The green-haired student struggled and tried to get up, only to be put down again by a precisely aimed finishing shot. The PE teacher looked out at the students scattered across the ground, too stunned to speak. In the end, he had no choice but to clench his jaw and announce Abel's team the winner. Everyone burst into enthusiastic cheers, celebrating the comeback victory. Alyssa turned to Ted excitedly and asked why he had been hiding his strength before. Ted could only fumble awkwardly, insisting it had all been a coincidence. Noticing that all the attention had shifted to Ted, Abel let out a quiet breath of relief. Just then, the green-haired student swayed to his feet, his face written all over with bitterness and humiliation. Abel looked at him coldly and told him he didn't know how hard the internal students had worked, but what he could say with certainty was that Ted had earned his place here, purely through his own ability. Built from countless days and nights of studying and training, the green-haired student heard him out, then slumped to the ground without another word. Then a friendly hand appeared in front of him. Ted crouched down and invited him again to eat buns together sometime. Abel shook his head. He still hadn't given up on selling his buns. The green-haired student sat there with his head down, clearly going through something internally. Finally, he just let out a cool dismissive scoff and turned to help his teammate up instead. Alyssa was unimpressed, thinking he had some nerve being so ungrateful, but Ted laughed it off optimistically, saying it was still progress. After all, this time the guy hadn't slapped his hand away. He reaffirmed his goal of making 100 friends with fresh conviction. Abel watched the whole scene, a faint smile quietly finding its way to his lips. As dusk fell, Headmaster Mikhail walked alone through a dim corridor. He moved toward a concealed door and opened it silently with magic. Behind it was Teacher Emerson's cramped and cluttered underground workshop. Emerson was staring intently at a screen. On it, the footage of that afternoon's match played on repeat. Emerson told the headmaster that it had been captured by a scout drone of his own design. The footage replayed the moment Ted cast his magic. The instant the magic bullets came raining from above, Mikhail watched closely, his expression gradually shifting to one of surprise. Emerson pointed out excitedly that it was an exceptionally brilliant piece of disguise magic. Abel had been silently mouthing something at the time. Emerson's eyes blazed with obsession. He was going to find out exactly who Abel was. The day of the outing arrived before long. Abel remembered Alyssa's invitation. As he came down from the dormitory, the person on duty gave him a slight pause. Lilith was standing there, a gentle smile on her face. She assumed he was heading to the library as usual, but Abel held out the completed leave form. Lilith's smile froze instantly on her face. She asked quietly whether he was going out with their classmate Alyssa because she had just received another leave form with nearly identical details. Abel didn't understand. Was there something wrong with that? Lilith bit her lip and forced the bitterness back down. In the end, she just shook her head and told him to have fun. Abel turned to leave, completely missing the disappointment on her face. Just as he was about to push the door open, someone caught his sleeve. Lilith's eyes were lowered, her voice barely above a whisper. She asked if he could perhaps find time to take her out for a walk sometime too. Abel was a little surprised, but he agreed. Lilith immediately lifted her face and broke into a radiant, brilliant smile. The smile stirred something in Abel. He was reminded of how she had looked as a child. Even having lived through 200 years, she still showed that childlike expression every now and then. Just then, he suddenly recalled the earnest confession she had made 2 years ago. He supposed that was probably just the fond affection a child had for someone older. Out at the plaza, Alyssa had already been waiting for some time. Abel apologized for being late, which seemed to catch her off guard. She laughed and teased him, saying she hadn't expected him to know how to say sorry. Then she declared with full confidence that today, she was going to take him through every corner of the royal capital. Their first stop was a towering memorial clock tower. Abel was completely captivated by the intricate interlocking gears. Alyssa, meanwhile, leaned against the window and called out to him excitedly to look at the view. Under the clear sky, the line of sight stretched all the way out to the distant horizon of the sea. Abel's gaze was caught by a moving black dot on the water. The ship's stern was trailing a long plume of dark smoke. Alyssa explained that it was a steamship. Didn't he even know what that was? Abel thought back to what he had read in the books. A wave of genuine curiosity washed over him. Alyssa watched him as he gazed out in concentration, and something quietly took root in the depths of her heart. After that, they listened to a new style of music, watched a romantic film. Abel quietly took in the kind of aliveness that no book could capture. As they passed through a lively street, a shop with a dazzling sign caught his eye. Alyssa explained it was what they called an amusement hall, a place for entertainment, usually somewhere idle people went to burn through their money and time. To her surprise, Abel was immediately interested. His eyes lit up as he said he wanted to go in and have a look. Alyssa was caught off guard, but agreed to go along anyway. Unknown to them, MSN's surveillance drone was following their every move. The two stepped inside, immediately swallowed by a wave of noise and crowds. The bizarre and colorful attractions left Abel feeling both foreign and fascinated. Then, an unpleasant voice suddenly came from behind them, followed by a skeletal hand landing on Alyssa's shoulder. The skeleton lurched forward, and Alyssa let out a startled shriek. On pure instinct, she spun around and grabbed Abel, pulling him into a tight hold. Abel reassured her it was just a magic prop. Alyssa came to her senses, mortified, and quickly pulled away from him. The skeleton cheerfully pointed them toward the attractions area. The moment the two stepped inside, Alyssa's eyes lit up immediately. Right, there was her favorite series of monster claw machines. She excitedly explained that the plushies were made to look like magical beasts. Abel looked at the figures and found them oddly familiar. Quite a few of them looked exactly like monsters he had once fought himself. Alyssa pointed to her favorite, Gemma's. Not exactly what one would call an adorable magical beast, but it looked incredibly powerful and had to be a formidable fighter. Abel nodded in unconscious agreement. Gemma's was indeed powerful. It could turn anything and everything to stone. It had taken wind magic and great effort to bring it down back in the day. Alyssa threw a questioning glance his way, and his chest tightened. He realized in that instant that he had let something slip. He scrambled quickly for a way to explain it away. But then Alyssa suddenly laughed and said what a strange joke that was. He went along with it and let that be his cover. But Alyssa grew unexpectedly self-conscious, asking whether he found her odd. All the other girls liked cute things. She was the only one who liked something fierce. Abel shook his head and said sincerely that it suited her perfectly. He thought inner qualities mattered more than outward appearances. That stopped Alyssa in her tracks, and a quiet warmth settled into her chest. She said brightly that she liked Gemma's even more now. Abel asked if she wanted the plushie. Alyssa fidgeted a little, admitting she did, but complaining about how tiny the claw was. Abel quietly put his magic to work, analyzing the machine's mechanics. He found that the grip strength had been set to the absolute minimum, and the controls deliberately made sluggish. He laughed coldly and sighed. A setup this crooked was exactly what he needed. He dropped in a coin ready to turn the impossible into the inevitable. Magic settled silently onto the mechanical claw, strengthening its grip. The claw descended steadily and locked firmly around the Gemma's plushie. Alyssa held her breath, watching the figure be lifted securely into the air, and then it dropped cleanly into the slot. Abel's second encounter with Gemma's ended in victory once again. He took out the plushie and held it out to Alyssa. Alyssa's cheeks flushed a visible shade of red. She took the plushie and instinctively held it up to hide her burning face. She promised she would take very good care of it. That flustered expression was not lost on Abel at all. They walked into a dessert cafe afterward. Alyssa closed her eyes in contentment, praising the waffles out loud. It was Abel's first time trying one. Alyssa's eyes drifted to his portion, and she asked if she could have a bite. Abel agreed. He cut off a piece and offered it over, but Alyssa simply ate it right off his fork without a second thought. She gave a thoughtful assessment of the waffle's flavor. Abel began eating his own portion. The taste really was quite good. Then he remarked that he was a little surprised. He had expected her to mind the indirect contact. Alyssa froze, and her face turned red at an alarming speed. Abel realized only then that she hadn't even registered it at the time. He apologized for saying something unnecessary. Alyssa composed herself as best she could and insisted stiffly that it was nothing worth making a fuss about. Seeing her embarrassment, Abel dropped the subject. He turned to look out the window instead and noticed something distinct about the atmosphere of the street. Alyssa agreed that the vintage aesthetic here had a particular charm, but Abel said quietly that the scenery made him feel something closer to nostalgia. That stopped Alyssa cold. She pointed out that finding something charmingly retro and personally feeling nostalgic were completely different things. Abel was suddenly at a loss for words, realizing he had let something slip again. Alyssa looked directly at him and asked the question she had held inside for a long time. Just who exactly was he? The question sent Abel into silence. He had no intention of telling anyone about his secret of reincarnation. All he wanted was to live a peaceful school life. Just at that moment, a glint in the not-so-far distance stung his eyes. It was a surveillance magic tool, pointed directly at them. He decided to deal with the annoyance first and cut the questioning short. Alyssa watched him, puzzled. The next instant, Abel's face drew close to hers with startling speed, close enough that she could feel his breath. Her heart lurched into a sprint, but Abel's target was the sky behind her. A silent fireball launched and shattered the surveillance device. The explosion made Alyssa snap her head around, and then she suddenly understood. He asked her what she'd been about to say. She lowered her head and said quietly to forget it, and apologized for prying into his private matters, her expression unable to hide the sting. Though avoiding further questioning was a good thing, Abel still felt unsettled. Alyssa bit her lower lip, a wave of bittersweet feelings surging through her. She didn't want to see that look in his eyes again, the one that deliberately closed off and shut her out. And in that moment, it became undeniably clear to her. She was afraid she had actually, genuinely fallen for Abel. At dusk, the two arrived back at the academy gates together, but Abel sensed that the surveillance had not stopped. He was growing tired of it and decided to handle the tale on his own terms. He made up an excuse and sent Alyssa ahead. Alyssa nodded, said her goodbye, and walked on. Abel turned and headed down a deserted alley. He stopped deep within it, and clearly sensed two hidden presences. He told whoever was hiding in the shadows to come out. Now a female mage materialized from the darkness. Abel noticed her grey eyes immediately. It was a technique that used earth element magic to blend into one's surroundings. Her revealing clothing was likely meant to increase the precision of her magic. At that moment, another voice came from the rooftop above. A male mage dropped down, expressing surprise that such a young boy had managed to detect them. The female mage let slip that it was no wonder, considering he was acquainted with that person. Abel latched onto it immediately and pressed her on who had commissioned them. The male mage quickly scolded his partner for always saying more than she should. He turned around and declared firmly that he would not reveal the client under any circumstances. That was all Abel needed to feel genuinely engaged. Only an opponent of this caliber was worth taking seriously. At that same moment, Professor Emerson was making his way alone through the academy's corridors. A familiar loneliness clung to him like a shadow, as it always did. No one argues with insects, and no one goes stargazing with apes. There had never been a single person in the world who could discuss magic with him as an equal. The staggering talent he had shown from childhood, inventing magic tools on his own at an early age, had brought him not understanding, but a profound and unbridgeable isolation. Others flattered him to his face, calling him a genius, but behind his back came envy and ridicule. Overwhelming ability had given birth to a loneliness with no bottom. When he first entered the academy, he had tried to fit in, but he quickly came to understand that accommodating mediocrity was a senseless retreat. A diamond can only be polished by another diamond or something harder. Without a worthy opponent, even a genius cannot truly grow. There had been times when he felt so suffocated, he could barely find a reason to go on, until Abel appeared, like a light cutting through the dark. Observing and testing this young man's abilities had reawakened his excitement. To that end, he had not hesitated to call upon the resources of the Magic Society. Chronos, those two skilled mags were his fellow members. To understand Abel, he was willing to use whatever means necessary. He pushed open the door to his workshop, and froze instantly, eyes going wide. Abel was sitting calmly in his chair, drinking tea. The young man turned and greeted him, apologizing for the intrusion. Emerson forced down his shock and asked how he had broken through the layers of barriers. The defensive magic he had laid down was far more than just 2 or 3 layers deep. Abel said those barriers were like tissue paper. Emerson laughed it off awkwardly, and praised him as impressive and full of surprises. But Abel cut through the pretense without another word. He told Emerson that his associates had already told him everything. His demand was simple: stop all surveillance immediately. Emerson stood there completely stunned, utterly unprepared to be exposed this fast. Were Abel to have forced those two to talk? What kind of power must that have taken? He steadied himself and asked with a probing edge, what if he refused? The words had barely left his mouth when a terrifying surge of magic enveloped him. Abel's eyes were ice cold, carrying the unmistakable weight of a death threat. Emerson was paralyzed by the sheer force of that presence. His body wouldn't stop shaking, but buried beneath the fear was a different feeling altogether, something like fascination. He gave in at last, saying he would accept every demand. Abel slowly withdrew that suffocating energy. Emerson exhaled in relief, but his curiosity got the better of him. He asked why he was even staying at this academy. There should be nothing here worth learning anymore. Abel said he simply wanted a quiet, uneventful school life. Nothing more than that. Emerson's eyes cooled, and he said that was far too much of a joke. He lowered his voice and spoke of what he saw as the destiny of a genius. With power like that, changing the world as he pleased was within reach. Even ruling over ordinary people was no fantasy. Abel's brow furrowed, and his revulsion was plain on his face. He brushed past him without ceremony, said flatly he had no interest in any of that, and walked out without looking back. Emerson slumped against the desk, his heart still hammering wildly. He had encountered many brilliant people, but he had never felt a killing intent like that. A smile of excitement curved the corner of his mouth. He was certain that Abel's existence would push him to an entirely new level. The night grew deeper. Alyssa came to find Abel with the plushie in her arms. She learned from Ted that he wasn't in, and stayed to wait on her own at the foot of the dormitory building. She wanted to give him the plushie and say thank you in person. As she gently stroked the figure, a familiar voice drifted over from the direction of the trees. Abel's tone was impatient, asking why she had come at this hour. A woman's voice offered a soft apology. Alyssa slipped behind cover to watch. When she saw who it was, she was stunned. The person speaking with Abel was Teacher Lilith. Lilith spoke softly of how much she had missed him. Abel reminded her that she should avoid drawing unnecessary attention to herself. He turned to leave, telling her to save whatever she had to say for after class. What happened next nearly stopped Alyssa's breath. Lilith rose on her tiptoes and pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead. Lilith's cheeks were flushed, and Abel just sighed with exasperated resignation, saying she hadn't changed one bit from when she was small. Alyssa shrank back into the shadows. What on earth was going on? The next day, Alyssa sat in a cafe in a sullen mood. When Yukari arrived, she immediately sensed something was off. Alyssa, who never turned down a sweet, had only ordered a black coffee. Yukari leaned in with concern and asked if something was troubling her. Alyssa finally said in a low voice what she had witnessed. She had seen Teacher Lilith kiss Abel on the forehead. She couldn't help but wonder if the two of them were together. Yukari blinked at that, then understood at once what was weighing on Alyssa's mind. She quickly smiled and reassured her that there was absolutely nothing to worry about, because Abel and Teacher Lilith were actually siblings, older sister and younger brother. That piece of news had already made its way around the whole academy. Ted had confirmed it too. Alyssa found it hard to believe, but she still thought it was strange. Why would real siblings have to meet in secret and express their feelings through something like a kiss of all things? Yukari guessed that they were probably being careful because of the teacher-student dynamic between them, and that since they were simply very close, a kiss was just their way of showing affection. Alyssa thought it over and decided that made sense. The cloud over her heart lifted in an instant, and her appetite came roaring back. She was going to order the biggest slice of cake on the menu. Yukari watched her spring back to life and couldn't help but laugh. At the same time, Abel was alone in the underground training room, running. He had already been running for 2 hours. This was nothing more than his usual daily routine. The training room was empty and quiet on a holiday. It gave him a vague sense of something. Modern Mag seemed to have completely neglected physical conditioning. Just then, Ted came hollering into the room, having tracked him down at last. Abel felt a flicker of resignation. His peaceful retreat had been discovered. Ted excitedly asked whether he had decided which research club to join. Abel only then recalled having heard something about it during enrollment, but he admitted honestly that he had no interest in it whatsoever. Ted eagerly explained that research clubs were voluntary after-school groups. There had even been cases where club findings received national recognition. Abel was privately unimpressed. That was still just student-level work. He had learned through countless years of experience that researching magic was something that had to be done alone. Working with others, in his view, served little purpose. but Ted refused to let it go and kept insisting there might be something that would catch his interest. Abel found himself wavering. It was hardly fair to dismiss something as trivial without even seeing it first, and beyond that, Ted's eyes were full of nothing but pure, earnest expectation. In the end, Abel let out a sigh and gave in. Ted burst into a cheer. He brought Abel along to where the clubs were recruiting. The place was buzzing with noise. People kept stopping Ted enthusiastically, hoping he would join their club. Abel observed quietly, noting that the clubs were divided into two broad types, magic-based and athletic, but there were simply too many of them to look into each one properly. Just then, a low voice came from behind them. Standing there was a towering figure in full armor. It gave Ted quite a fright. The figure laughed and removed the helmet, explaining it was just competition gear. He then praised Ted's build and invited him to try Armored Ball. The string of technical terms left Ted completely baffled, but Abel beside him understood perfectly. It sounded very much like an ancient sport similar to rugby. Ted turned to invite his master to go have a look with him, but the senior student's expression became awkward as his eyes landed on Abel. He tactfully suggested it would be a little inconvenient for a student with amber eyes to participate. Abel was long accustomed to being treated as someone incapable of wielding magic, which suited him fine. It gave him a natural reason to leave. Just then, the captain of the club came over in his armor. The senior leaned in and quietly explained the situation. Upon hearing it, the captain burst out laughing without the slightest attempt to conceal it. He declared plainly that letting someone with inferior eyes join would drag the whole club's reputation through the mud. Abel sighed, wanting no part of any further confrontation, but Ted's brow had already furrowed tight. Abel gave Ted a light flick on the ear, signaling that it wasn't worth getting worked up over. He had no interest in ball sports anyway, so leaving was no loss. What he hadn't expected was that those words would accidentally ignite the captain's fury. The captain suddenly flew into a rage, announcing that being looked down on was the one thing he couldn't stand. The sheer hypocrisy of that left both Abel and Ted without words. Before anyone could respond, the captain grabbed the ball and came charging straight at Abel, shouting that he was about to show him this was far more than just ball sports. Abel ducked nimbly to the side and swept the captain's legs out from under him. The captain stumbled on one foot. The ball flew out of his arms and sailed into the air. He barely managed to steady himself, but the humiliation had consumed his last shred of reason, and so he charged at Abel a second time. Abel resigned himself. This wasn't going to end cleanly. He leaped lightly into the air and caught the falling ball with ease. From midair, he called out casually, "Ball's coming back to you," but he had quietly applied a material enhancement spell to it. The ball came down carrying a staggering amount of force and drove straight into the captain's face. A dull thud. The captain hit the ground hard. The sudden turn of events instantly drew every pair of eyes in the area. Abel realized he had gotten carried away once again. While everyone rushed toward the captain, Abel and Ted slipped quietly away from the crowd. They went on to visit many other clubs, but still couldn't find one that felt right. Ted, on the other hand, was welcomed everywhere, while Abel found himself thoroughly uninterested in all of them. He was on the verge of giving up when a burst of passionate chanting reached his ears. A group of people in black robes had gathered in a corner, calling loudly for a peaceful world. Abel looked more closely. What they wanted to cut from the world was magic itself. He found that baffling. If they were against magic, why come to this academy? Their leader raised a fist and declared that the age of revolution had arrived. Abel looked again and stopped cold. The one leading the group was none other than Boss, whom he hadn't seen in a long time. He had known Boss was at the academy, but never expected to run into him like this. Boss didn't look well, yet his eyes were frightfully sharp. A wave of unease rose within Abel. He called over the green-haired student to ask what was going on. The other student looked at him with surprise, as though he had asked something everyone already knew. He explained it was a radical anti-magic organization. They preached peace on the surface, but had caused no small amount of trouble for society. Seeing that Abel was in the dark, the student's tone slipped back into its usual condescension. He sneered that it figured. No research club would want to take in someone with inferior eyes. Abel had no interest in arguing. He turned to leave, but the student called after him, saying he had just the place, the perfect club for someone like him. They stopped in front of a quiet, deserted booth. A blue-eyed girl sat alone under a canopy, reading in silence. Everyone who passed by gave it a wide berth as though it were off-limits. The green-haired student called her the Ice Queen Noelle. She possessed overwhelming ability, yet never spoke with anyone. He said that in that way, she and Abel were very much alike, both unfriendly outsiders. Perhaps they would get on well. With that, he turned and left. Abel observed her carefully. Those blue eyes were indeed the mark of water element magic. Her magic was noticeably stronger than that of the average student. The sign at the booth read, Ancient Magic Research Club. It carried an air of mystery. Abel lightly knocked on the table in front of her. Noelle finally looked up and regarded him with cool indifference. Abel stated plainly that he was interested in ancient magic and wanted to hear more. Noelle said nothing extra. She simply closed the thick book in her hands, then placed a square wooden box on the table and told him to open it first. Abel recognized the object immediately. It was a labyrinth circuit, a mysterious device used to test ability through the deciphering of complex runes. And this particular one, so finely made, had very likely been crafted by her own hand. Without another word, he ran his fingertips across the surface of the box and began analyzing the runes. His magic flowed precisely, guided by his will, along the one correct path. With a soft click, the lid sprang open. Noelle's eyes went wide instantly, her face written over with disbelief. Abel set the box down calmly and told her it was open. She took it back and examined it over and over, suspecting it had broken. After all, most people needed at least an hour to solve it. Abel offered no explanation and simply reminded her that she had made a promise. Noelle studied him with a complicated expression, then finally relented. He followed her quiet footsteps as they went inside. A sign on the wall reading, No students beyond this point, stood out prominently. He asked where they were headed. Noelle pointed forward, but what lay ahead was nothing more than a cold stone wall. She reached up and took a small pendant from around her neck. It looked like a seal. She pressed it against, an inconspicuous golden relief carved into the wall, and then a hidden doorway silently took shape in the stone. Abel stepped through after her. A world swallowed by books opened up before him. Noelle announced softly that this was the research club. Abel looked around. Hundreds upon hundreds of volumes, an impressive sight. He asked where the other members were and received an unexpected answer. Noelle told him plainly that she was currently the club's only member. Abel suspected the labyrinth circuit was the reason. He walked toward the shelves and began leafing through at random. All of it was ancient texts, clearly from a great many years ago. He asked which was the oldest volume in the collection. Noelle said with quiet regret that many magical texts had been burned during the Great Calamity. Abel fell silent, fragments of history piecing themselves together in his mind. 200 years ago, the sages defeated the Demon King, but the peace was desperately short-lived. Driven by the hunger for territory, humanity plunged almost immediately into a war far longer and more brutal. 100 years of bloodshed. The lives it claimed far exceeded anything the Demon King had ever taken. Exhaustion and suffering turned into a deep hatred of magic. A movement arose with the aim of wiping magic from the world entirely. Countless precious magical tomes were reduced to ash in the flames, and to uncover the secrets of the ancient magic that had once far surpassed what existed today. That was the purpose for which this research club existed. Abel thought that was a remarkable motivation. He knew that in this era most people could no longer even perceive the decline of magic. To have recognized it and taken action was already something exceptional. Noelle was surprised. She asked why he wasn't mocking her the way everyone else did. After all, most people thought magic tools were simply more convenient. Abel understood that frustration deeply. In an environment like this, she had chosen to hold on and pursue ancient magic. She must have endured a great deal of loneliness and the weight of being misunderstood. So he told her with complete sincerity that he would never mock her efforts. Those words stirred something quietly within Noelle. She asked for his name in a soft voice, a hint of shyness in her tone, then formally introduced herself and handed him a key to the room. She invited him to come back tomorrow. There was something she wanted to show him. The next evening came quickly. Abel found Ted asleep in the library. Knowing he had been run ragged by clubs chasing him for days, he didn't have the heart to wake him. He left alone but was stopped in the corridor by Alyssa. She asked with some nervousness which research club he was thinking of joining. When she learned he still hadn't decided, she gathered her courage and extended an invitation. She admitted that she had always longed to experience riding a flying dragon. A thread of nostalgia stirred within Abel as well. Since reincarnating, he had not yet seen a dragon in this era, so he agreed to go with her and have a look. Alyssa lit up at once, checked with him several times to be sure, then bounced off happily. Abel couldn't help but think she really ought to make more friends. Afterward he headed for the Ancient Magic Research Club, but at the door, he sensed a familiar presence. It was teacher Emerson. Abel went straight to the point and asked what he was doing there. Emerson smiled and said he was the club's faculty advisor, then quickly added that he only dropped by occasionally. The over-explanation only made Abel more suspicious. Emerson turned it around and asked what he was there for. Abel said he had a prior arrangement with someone. Emerson raised an eyebrow, his expression carrying a meaningful undertone. He let slip with an air of mystery that Noel was a genius personally recommended by the headmaster. Within just 1 year, she had been granted exemption from all standard classes and was self-studying here because most of the faculty's courses no longer met her needs. With that said, he suggested Abel apply for the same exemption. Abel declined immediately. He reiterated that all he wanted was a quiet, uneventful school life. But Emerson's smile suddenly dropped and he pointed out the contradiction. As long as Abel was in contact with Noel, quiet and uneventful was never going to happen. Abel argued that he was simply interested in the book collection. Emerson pressed further, pointing out the inconsistency in his behavior. If he truly craved calm, why would ancient magic hold any interest for him at all? Emerson slowly drew closer, hand reaching out as though to touch Abel's cheek. But in the end, he only clapped him on the shoulder instead. His tone shifted back to its usual lightness and he turned to leave with a smile. Abel stood there alone with a decidedly strange feeling. He quietly activated his analytical eye. A tiny magical rune appeared on his shoulder, a listening device. He raised his hand and crushed it without a second's hesitation. Emerson, wherever he was, smiled knowingly, found out as expected. Abel pushed the door open and stepped into the research club. Noel was reading quietly. When she saw him arrive, she set the book down at once. She said softly that she had been waiting, with an oddly direct candor. A faint sense of something passed through Abel. Was that a friendly thing to say? He brought up the arrangement and asked what she had wanted to show him. Noel lifted a wooden box with careful, deliberate hands. From inside, she drew out an old and damaged ancient book. Abel could see at a glance that it was sealed under layers of powerful runes. Noel said her family called it the Forbidden Grimoire. Abel recalled what the history books recorded, that this text harbored power capable of shaking the world. During the era of the Great Calamity, it had been the spark that ignited conflict more than once. He asked why she was showing him something so dangerous. Noel said she heard he might want to see it, so she brought it. Abel recognized the immense value of the book and began forming a new suspicion about her lineage. Noel undid the seals, saying this was a treasure she was showing only to him. Abel leaned in to examine it. The pages were engraved with extraordinarily complex magical formulas. Even in their damaged state, the level of craft was unmistakably high. He turned the pages quickly and found the handwriting strangely familiar, too, until he saw the inscription. To my dear comrade Adona. He went still. A storm broke loose inside him. He asked if this book was a relic left by one of her ancestors. Noel nodded and said her ancestor had received it from a mage they deeply respected. She asked if he could understand it. Abel gave a modest answer on the surface. Inside, he felt anything but calm, because this book had been written by his own hand. He pointed to the pages and gave her a rough explanation of what was written. As he spoke, he quietly observed her reactions and her face. The line of her brow and eyes gradually overlapped with a face from long ago. He was certain now. Noel was a descendant of Adona, the hero of water. Noel listened with total absorption, pure delight spreading across her face. She begged him to tell her more of the book's secrets, but Abel already had plans the following day. He saw an opportunity and proposed a trade. If she would let him use this research room, he would come back in his spare time and continue reading the grimoire with her. Noel accepted the terms and smiled with genuine happiness. The next day, Abel and Alyssa arrived at the Dragon Stables. A single voice welcomed them all with theatrical flair. Then a procession of elegantly groomed, sweet-smelling young men filed in behind it. Everyone froze, this frivolous, idol-like spectacle standing before them. This was apparently the legendary dragon riding research club. Abel could not connect these people to dragons in any way. Caring for dragons had once been grueling work, demanding extraordinary patience and strength. Alyssa looked apologetic, having had no idea the club would be anything like this. A girl then asked what set this club apart from the one next door. The senior explained cheerfully that this one was far more relaxed, all about having a good time. Abel understood immediately and felt a small flicker of surprise alongside it. In the era he came from, dragons were precious and powerful strategic assets. It seemed that after 200 years, the world had truly grown prosperous. The senior announced that they would ride in pairs. Abel sensed immediately that something was off. Every girl in the room was being eagerly surrounded by boys. A headache began to form. Sacred creatures, being used as props for flirting. The senior strode directly toward Alyssa and called out her name with warm enthusiasm. Alyssa quickly darted behind Abel, saying she already had a partner. The senior's gaze immediately flicked to Abel, cold and displeased. He pushed his way between the two of them and invited Alyssa to ride with him instead. But Alyssa held onto Abel's arm and insisted she wanted to go with him. The senior smiled and turned her down, saying it was too dangerous to have two beginners on the same dragon. Alyssa was caught in a difficult position, her eyes full of conflicted disappointment. Abel could see how much she wanted to ride. He pushed down his own discomfort. He told her considerably not to worry about him, to go enjoy herself fully. But that show of consideration made Alyssa angry. She turned away, agreed to the senior's invitation with a huff, and stopped looking at him. Abel was left genuinely puzzled, unable to understand how he had managed to upset her. Stepping inside the dragon stables, that strong familiar smell hit him at once. The senior proudly showed off his prize dragon. Its enormous body was breathtaking. Alyssa gasped in delighted wonder. It was the largest dragon she had ever seen. Abel was quietly impressed as well. This dragon had been raised superbly. In his time, only those at the very top of the nobility could possess a beast of this magnitude. It seemed that after 200 years, humanity's skill in rearing dragons had grown considerably. The senior told Abel that his dragon was in the room at the very back, then led Alyssa away to enjoy their flight through the sky. Alyssa glanced back at him once before following along. The other visitors gradually made their way out as well. The dragon stables fell quiet, and Abel was the only one left. He walked alone toward the deepest part of the building, ready to meet the dragon assigned to him. Just then, a voice behind him called out with urgency. The person warned him not to go any closer to that room under any circumstances, because the dragon inside Reinhard had a particular hatred for humans. A small boy apologized for the abruptness and introduced himself as a junior handler who worked there. Abel said it was fine and that he simply wanted to meet the dragon quickly. The boy opened the door a crack and said seeing it firsthand would convey the danger better than words. Abel saw a massive red dragon, scars around its eyes, radiating arrogant authority. A rush of admiration rose in him immediately. This was a magnificent dragon. The boy explained that its name was Reinhard, and it was over 100 years old. It had once been a celebrated racing dragon, but after the death of its handler, it refused to submit to anyone. Most people advocated getting rid of it, but the boy had been firmly against it, because the younger dragons held it in great reverence, and its presence helped keep the stable stable. Abel understood at once. Dragons only respected those with true strength. For an aged dragon to command this level of esteem, its power was not to be underestimated. It had perhaps simply grown tired of being driven by those unworthy of it and chose to hide its strength. Abel called its name with a quiet gravity and extended his hand, signaling Reinhard to look at him. The boy was alarmed at the sight and rushed to stop what looked like a suicidal gesture. Abel told him to stay still and say nothing. Reinhard raised its proud head, eyes gleaming with a probing light. Abel read the wordless requests within them and asked if it wanted to go for a flight. He gathered a concentrated sphere of pure magic in his palm and held it out for the great dragon to see. Reinhard narrowed its eyes and watched for a moment. Then slowly, it lowered itself down. That act of submission left the boy utterly speechless. Abel said gently that it might consider giving the person before it a chance. Reinhard glanced over at the boy, and for just a moment, its gaze seemed to soften. The boy was overcome with emotion and asked urgently who Abel was. Abel said only that he was a student and that he was borrowing Reinhard. Out in the valley, several flying dragons were carrying students on a leisurely soaring flight. The senior brought Alyssa down to land on a quiet stretch of grass. Looking down at the royal capital and the academy shrunken far below, Alyssa was struck with wonder. She found herself thinking that it would have been so much better if Abel were here beside her. The senior handed her a cup of tea with a smile that carried something barely hidden beneath it. Alyssa didn't suspect a thing, thanked him, and drank, but then the senior suddenly embraced her from behind. She startled and knocked the teacup over. She demanded sharply to know what he thought he was doing and dealt him a sharp slap, fury burning through her. But the senior had the nerve to turn it around on her, claiming she had come here with ill intentions from the start. He then used filthy language to cast aspersions on her relationship with Abel. Alyssa's fury erupted completely. She summoned her magic ready to fight back, but a violent wave of dizziness slammed into her. She fell helplessly to the ground and understood instantly that the tea had been drugged. The senior boasted smugly about his excellent marks and potion studies. He looked down at her, unable to resist anything, and let a smug smile cross his face. Alyssa could only lie there as he drew closer. At that very moment, Abel was already soaring above the valley on Reinhard's back. He surveyed the valley below, only to find that most of the students were absorbed in their own romantic activities. His gaze swept across a patch of grass and stopped cold. The senior was closing in on Alyssa, who lay there struggling with no strength to resist. Alyssa's face was streaked with tears as she called Abel's name with everything she had. The senior sneered that the dragon he had lent to Abel was the most untamable one in the stables. He spat that a man with inferior eyes had probably already fallen to his death by now. Alyssa screamed at him with every ounce of rage she had left, calling him exactly what he was. The senior told her to use a cuter voice. His hand reached out without hesitation. He threatened her to be a good girl and comply. Fear gripped her completely. She could only cry out Abel's name over and over. At that very moment, a hand seized the senior by the hair. Abel's voice was cold as ice, asking whether this was a violation of academy regulations. Alyssa looked up at him, and the tears she had been holding back, the hurt, and the lingering terror finally broke through. The senior wrenched free in a panic. Abel told him bluntly that what he had done was assault. The senior tried to talk his way out of it, heart-hammering. He pointed at Alyssa, saying she had wanted it too, but Abel defended her without a shadow of doubt. She would never lower herself to someone like him. Those words broke through the darkness like a blade of light, and her tears finally came flooding out. Humiliated and livid, the senior pulled out his magic tool and snarled a stream of curses. He screamed that he would reduce both of them to ash. A blazing firebolt came roaring toward them, but Reinhard's broad wing deflected it effortlessly. Abel leaped lightly upward, reinforcing Reinhard with a defensive enhancement spell. Reinhard surged with energy, and a single beat of its wings shattered every attack in one go. Abel landed behind the senior like a ghost. The senior spun around in panic, but his hand was already locked in Abel's iron grip. A short incantation followed. The runes along the barrel of the magic tool went dark and dead. The senior pulled the trigger uselessly. Then, in desperate fury, he called his own flying dragon forward and ordered it to attack. The dragon named Holy Light hesitated for a moment before rising reluctantly. Just as it was preparing to dive, Reinhard brought one massive foot down with a thunderous stomp. An invisible dragon's authority spread out from it, freezing both the senior and his dragon in place. Then came an even more astonishing sight. Reinhard moved of its own accord, spreading its enormous wings. It wrapped them protectively around Abel, holding him close beneath. The warning and majesty in its gaze stripped Holy Light of all will to fight. The dragon even turned on its own target and grabbed its own panicking, screaming master. It took off without looking back, fleeing the sky entirely regardless of the senior's frenzied shouts. The danger passed. Alyssa could no longer hold herself together and threw herself into Abel's arms. On the way back, she sat on Reinhard's back and let a smile return to her face. Abel quietly breathed a sigh of relief, glad the awful memories hadn't been allowed to take root in her. He took the opportunity to glance around and check whether any other lowlifes were still down there. Then Alyssa suddenly called out loudly into his ear, wishing that time would just stop right here. But Abel's mind drifted somewhere else entirely, genuinely contemplating time magic. While Alyssa, leaning against his shoulder, was already drifting off to sleep, she murmured something without thinking, that he was really, truly handsome. Abel didn't catch it and asked her to repeat herself, only to be met with her flustered silence. And Reinhard carried the two of them onward, gliding smoothly through the golden evening light. That's all for today's recap. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like, and let me know in the comments, what score would you give this man Hua out of 10?